There is a moment, quiet, fleeting, where a thought flashes across the mind that feels like a crime, not because it has been acted on or even spoken aloud, but because it exists. A fantasy of vengeance, a desire for power, an impulse to destroy. Most people bury it immediately. They look around as if someone might have heard it, even though no sound was made. They tighten their grip on the mask and tell themselves it meant nothing, that it was an accident, that they are good. But the truth is, every human being has a dark side, and the more violently we try to deny it, the more violently it will try to be seen. I've worked with clients who believed they were losing their minds because of the thoughts they couldn't stop. Intrusive, obsessive, unwanted. They'd whisper them to me like confessions. Does this mean I'm a psychopath? And I'd say something like, ever wonder what would happen if you just swerved up onto the pavement and mowed down that old lady? And you'd see the blood drain from their face, then rush back in relief. That flicker of shared madness, that's the moment they realize they're not broken. They're just human. The issue isn't the thought, the issue is the fear, the shame, the compulsive need to exile the shadow from consciousness and pretend it never existed. But when you exile a part of yourself, it doesn't vanish. It festers. It finds new ways to return. Usually stronger, usually louder. This is how you end up with a life run by avoidance, rituals, self-loathing, or numbness masquerading as control. The mind doesn't always speak in words. The unconscious deals in symbols, in dreams, in fragments and flickers. It's like watching a film without subtitles. You'll feel something, but if you don't pause to decode the plot, you'll misread everything. You might think the scene of destruction in your mind is a sign you're dangerous, when in reality it's your psyche waving a flag that you're starving, tired, grieving, or furious at something you haven't named. Sometimes you're not a monster, you're just dehydrated, or hangry. Sometimes your shadow isn't trying to kill anyone, it just needs you to listen. The tragedy is this: we're trained to respond to discomfort like it's evidence of a problem, rather than an invitation to look closer. But repression is a terrible therapist. It buries symptoms, it postpones explosions, and in the delay, it breeds pathology. The real danger isn't the shadow, it's pretending it isn't there, because the dark doesn't shrink under shame, it grows. No one teaches you how to deal with your darker instincts, but everyone trains you to fear them. From the moment you first feel envy, rage, lust, or power hunger, you're told to shrink. Smile, be nice, be quiet, be manageable. We are not educated in self-governance. We are conditioned for self-rejection. And so your unconscious becomes the landfill for everything socially unacceptable. It stores what you weren't allowed to be. Not because you chose it, but because the culture trained you to believe that approval was survival, and anything threatening, that approval had to be exiled. The shadow, then, is not the problem. It's the storage system, and the messages it sends, those flashes of sabotage or aggression, are not acts of rebellion, they are warning signals. Your unconscious doesn't have the sophistication of your conscious mind. It doesn't speak in full sentences or diplomatic phrasing. It speaks in primal, raw, metaphorical pulses. It shows you a movie of violence when it's trying to get your attention. It recreates a toxic craving when it's trying to say, I need something. But instead of listening, most people tighten their grip on the reins. They mistake the message for a threat. They crush the symptom and never ask about the source. This is how the internal war begins. You believe the darker parts of you are enemies, and that belief makes them enemies, because when the shadow is ignored, it gets louder. When it's shamed, it gets spiteful. Not because it's evil, but because it's desperate to keep you alive. That's its one job. Protect the system, even if the method is crude, even if the logic is outdated, even if the strategy is destruction. Take addiction. The logic is clear. This thing will kill me. And yet, the craving returns. Why? Because to the shadow, smoking or drinking or doom-scrolling or rage isn't about the act. It's about the relief. Maybe smoking is the only time you breathe deeply. Maybe scrolling is the only moment your mind slows down. Maybe anger is the only feeling that makes you feel strong instead of sad. The act is the surface. The need is the root. And the shadow is the one digging. This is the invisible training. Your shadow has been keeping score long before your intellect caught up. It remembers every moment you were silenced, abandoned, humiliated, or overwhelmed, and it keeps offering solutions that match that outdated map, not because it's trying to drag you backwards, but because it doesn't yet know you're safe enough to move forward. Integration isn't about becoming a better person. It's about becoming an honest one. Because you can't rule your kingdom with half your court exiled. Eventually, the peasants revolt. The exiles storm the gates. And the person who thought they were in control realizes they were never running the show at all. The price of suppressing the shadow doesn't come in one big crash. It comes in the erosion, a slow, steady loss of self that you can't quite track until one day you're living a life that's technically fine, but viscerally hollow. Your instincts feel off. Your relationships run on half-truths. Your laughter is a bit too forced. Your smile's a bit too timed. And when someone finally crosses the line, you erupt like it was the first offense. Because all the offenses before that were buried in the name of being good. You see it in the people who try to be saints. They choke on their halos. They bend themselves into shapes so pleasing that they forget they have a spine. And when the mask finally slips, it's never graceful. It's rage, or retreat, or a quiet, invisible collapse into numbness. That's the slow burn cost, not just emotional exhaustion, but identity erosion. You forget who you are underneath the performance. You spend so long avoiding being a villain that you lose access to the kind of power that could have protected you. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Not all darkness is damage. Some of it is defense. Some of it is depth. And when you amputate it to appease others, you don't become more enlightened. You become more manipulable. Keep listening, because I'm about to show you what this looks like in real life, and how the unconscious uses projection to keep you blind to the truth. Let me tell you what always gives the game away. The criticism. When someone is constantly irked by arrogance, I know they're denying their own hunger to be admired. When someone rages at liars, they've probably lied in a way that still haunts them. And when someone tells me they just hate drama, I know they're either full of it or utterly addicted to it. What we despise in others is often what we've buried in ourselves. And if you're not conscious of that, your shadow will run your life like a puppeteer, pulling strings while you insist you're the rational one. You can't fix what you won't face. And when the cost of repression is years of miscommunication, passive aggression, resentment, burnout, fractured relationships and lost potential, the idea of keeping the peace starts to look a lot like treason against yourself. There was a woman I worked with once. We'll call her Lydia. On the surface, she was pristine, kind, composed, endlessly patient. The kind of woman who remembered people's wedding anniversaries, spoke softly, and always offered you the last biscuit. But underneath, something festered. She didn't understand why she was so bitter, why she judged other women so harshly, why she couldn't relax around people she claimed to love. Every kindness she gave out felt laced with an aftertaste, like she was giving it, but also punishing herself for needing anything back. She came to me saying, "I think I might be broken." She wasn't. She was just exhausted from carrying the weight of a persona that wasn't built to survive. We spent weeks peeling it back. She'd say things like, "I hate needy people," and I'd say, "Okay, tell me about the last time you needed someone and felt ashamed of it." That's when the tears came. Her story wasn't just one of repression, it was of self-betrayal. She'd learned very early that anger was dangerous, that ambition was unladylike, and that sadness made you a burden. So she buried those instincts, smiled instead, but the shadow keeps receipts. And over time her resentment turned corrosive, not just toward others, but toward herself. What saved her wasn't some grand intervention. It was a single moment where she admitted, "Sometimes I want to scream at people." That was the crack, the honesty, the recognition that rage isn't always cruelty, it's protest. It's the part of you that refuses to keep tolerating what's intolerable. And in owning it, she didn't become worse. She became clearer, cleaner. She started to say no. She left the relationship that had been leeching her dry. She stopped apologizing every time she needed something. She didn't become a monster. She just stopped pretending she wasn't human. That's the mirror. We think the shadow is something external. We think it's in the narcissist ex, the cruel parent, the reckless politician, the toxic boss. But the real terror is realizing that it's in us too. That under the right conditions, with enough stress or silence or unacknowledged pain, we could become the very thing we swore we'd never be. And if that thought horrifies you, good. That means you're paying attention. Because people who deny their dark side aren't safe. They're dangerous. They're dishonest. And dishonesty is the quickest way to harm the people you claim to protect. The shadow doesn't need to be punished. It needs to be named. That's how the mirror turns from a weapon into a map. It doesn't show you what's wrong. It shows you where to begin. There is a moment in every transformation that doesn't feel noble. It feels humiliating. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you finally see what you've been denying. You see the masks you wore so tightly, they reshaped your face. You see the people you blamed for things you tolerated. You see the way your own goodness became a prison. And for a split second, you wonder if maybe the villains were freer than you. This is the awakening, not some new age light burst of enlightenment, but the sobering realization that the parts of yourself you exiled were never evil. They were efficient, sharp, director, sometimes angry. But anger, unlike niceness, has a backbone. It says no, it draws blood when necessary, and most people fear that power because they've never been taught how to hold it without becoming what they hate. So instead, they fake peace. They confuse meekness for virtue. But suppression is not strength. It is stagnation. And it leaks. The truly dangerous people are not the ones who feel their darkness. It's the ones who deny it. The ones who keep saying, "I'm fine," while their boundaries collapse. The ones who pride themselves on politeness, while quietly sabotaging everything they touch. The ones who believe they're above temptation while indulging it in shadows. These are the people who explode when finally pressed. Not because the shadow arrived, but because it had been locked in a box for too long. Keep listening, because I'm going to show you a model that explains exactly why this happens, and how to stop it from running your life. See, to awaken is not to become invincible. It's to become intolerant of self-deceit. It's the moment you stop letting your shadow run wild in the background, and instead invite it to sit at the table with the rest of you, not to take over, but to speak, to explain, to negotiate, because when the part of you that once had to scream finally gets heard, the screaming stops. And in that quiet, something surprising happens. You begin to feel whole, not pure, not perfect, just whole. This doesn't mean everything gets easy. It just means you finally stop making it harder than it needs to be. You stop fighting battles that don't belong to you. You stop carrying shame that never fit. And you start understanding that sometimes the part of you that feels monstrous isn't a threat. It's the muscle you need to finally stand your ground. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That is not poetry. That is neurology. Your brain is an efficiency machine. Most of what you do, feel, and react to is run on unconscious patterning. The shadow is not just a metaphor for evil, it's a map of everything that's been banished from consciousness. Your unmet needs, your unloved traits, your forbidden desires. All of it lives there, operating in the dark, shaping your decisions while you tell yourself you're just unlucky, or too nice, or always the one who gets hurt. This is the model that matters. Consciousness is not a hierarchy. It's a negotiation. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of you that plans, reasons, and speaks in language, is brilliant, but it is not in charge. Not when you're triggered. Not when you're scared. Not when you're exhausted or hungry or pushed past your limit. In those moments, your limbic system, the ancient emotional circuitry, takes the wheel, and the shadow lives there. Not in words, but in impulses. In survival. It has no time for your moral code. It doesn't care about optics. It cares about relief. This is where Jung meets Machiavelli. You can try to rule yourself with virtue, with patience, with compromise. But power doesn't respond to politeness. Not internally, not externally. Power responds to presence, clarity, fearless authority. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But what he was really saying was this: a ruler who ignores threat is not merciful. He is dead. The same is true inside you. If you ignore the threat signals from your shadow, if you mistake discomfort for disorder, you will be ruled by the very thing you're pretending doesn't exist. The shadow must be governed, not gagged. And governance means you have to know what you're dealing with. Is it grief? Is it unmet hunger? Is it ancient humiliation showing up as a panic attack in a board meeting? Is it rage disguised as apathy? You don't need to become a therapist. You need to become honest and curious. Because when you meet the shadow with contempt, it fights you. But when you meet it with structure, with rules, with room to speak, you begin to lead yourself in a way that no longer requires constant emotional firefighting. Your nervous system will reward you. Less hypervigilance, fewer blow-ups, cleaner exits from the situations that once kept you trapped. Integration isn't about blending good and evil into some middle path. It's about making sure every part of you knows who's in charge and what the mission is, because chaos only thrives in a system where leadership is absent. You are not meant to obey the shadow, but you are absolutely meant to understand it. So what do you actually do with all this? What does it look like to tame the shadow? Not to cage it, not to worship it, but to put it to work. It starts with a single decision. Stop flinching from what you feel. When an intrusive thought appears, pause. Not to analyze it to death, not to give it the keys to the kingdom, but to decode it. What's it pointing to? Hunger, resentment, fear of being seen. 9 times out of 10, what you call a bad habit is a badly translated need. Your shadow doesn't have a language center. It has symbols, tension, and metaphor. You have to become fluent in your own patterns if you ever want to rule them. This is how power is reclaimed in practice. Let's say your shadow keeps pushing you to scroll Instagram for hours. You could beat yourself up for being undisciplined, or you could pause and ask, what do I actually want here? Dopamine, escape, stimulation? Am I lonely? Am I avoiding a confrontation with someone or with myself? That small moment of inquiry is everything, because it doesn't hand control over to the impulse, but it doesn't deny it either. It listens, it decodes, it redirects. Same with rage. You don't explode at your boss, but you also don't tell yourself it's fine when it's not. You acknowledge the heat rising in your chest, you feel the clench in your jaw, and you find a place, privately, to let the anger speak. Maybe it wants you to stop staying late at work. Maybe it wants you to call out unfairness, even if your voice shakes. The shadow doesn't want to destroy your life. It wants to defend your boundary. But when it gets ignored long enough, it starts flipping tables just to be heard. Another one? Cravings, especially when you're trying to break a habit. That pull back to cigarettes, to overworking, to doom scrolling, to toxic exes. Instead of saying, why am I like this? Ask, what's the payoff here? Because there is one. And until you give yourself a better version of it, the shadow will keep rerouting you back to the old one. If smoking is your only deep breath of the day, of course you're craving it. Give yourself the breath. Give yourself the break. But do it consciously. That's how you train the shadow to trust you again. That's how you lead. This is not about perfect control. This is about consistent self-contact, leadership, agency. In those micro moments where you feel pulled towards something dark, ask, is this my shadow speaking? If so, what is it trying to protect? And is there a better way I can meet that need? That's it. That's the muscle. The more you use it, the quieter the chaos becomes, the more clarity you get, and the more the darker parts of you stop being a threat and start becoming an asset. So now you know, the darkness isn't your enemy, it's your inheritance. You were born with it, and no amount of breathing exercises or affirmations will scrub it out. But here's the thing, once you've stopped fearing it, once you've learned to name it, to negotiate with it, to let it speak without letting it drive, you get to choose what kind of ruler you want to be. You can be the benevolent monarch, self-aware, compassionate, in control. You can lead with clarity. You can run your kingdom with clean power, authority without cruelty. You'll be harder to manipulate, slower to explode, impossible to guilt trip. You'll spot projection when it's aimed at you, and you'll stop bleeding out in the name of keeping other people comfortable. That's what taming the dark side gives you. Not sainthood, not serenity, but sovereignty. But let's not pretend it's all soft focus healing and moonlit journaling. Integration has a price, because once you meet your shadow, you lose your excuses. You can't blame your patterns on childhood forever. You can't keep telling yourself you're powerless when you've just met the part of you that isn't. That's what burns. That's what separates the ones who dabble in shadow work from the ones who transform. Because once you've tasted that power, the real question isn't, can you tame your dark side? It's this. Do you even want to? Because there's a version of you out there, colder, sharper, clearer, less apologetic, more effective. The version that stops second-guessing and starts executing. The version that knows when to be merciful and when to be silent. The one who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone because the integration already happened. The throne's been claimed. So here's your warning and your invitation. Yes, you can tame the darkness. But once you know it's there, once you've learned its name, the leash is in your hands. What you do next, how much of it you allow, how far you let it rise, that's not about healing anymore. That's about who you're becoming.